There are moments in history where everything shifts, when the rules that once governed the world crumble under the weight of something greater. This is one of those moments. You are one of those forces. You weren't sent here to blend in, to follow paths already carved by others. You are here to disrupt, to awaken, to shift the axis of reality itself. The world may not have been ready, but that has never mattered. When destiny calls, it does not ask for permission. It demands recognition. They thought they were prepared, armed with knowledge, strategy, and control. But what they faced that day was beyond their reach. It wasn't just power. It was something they couldn't quantify, couldn't track, couldn't contain. They weren't looking at an anomaly. They were looking at the inevitable. And now they see you. Not as a target, not as an obstacle, but as a turning point. Because the moment you stepped into their world, you rewrote the rules. You didn't just change the game. You became the game. What once seemed infallible now crumbles at the edges, precision slipping through unseen fractures. The instruments, once obedient, bound to laws etched into existence, now whisper defiance. Readings stretch beyond their limits, not broken, but revealing something unscripted. Screens ignite with cascading geometries that pulse with intent, forming sequences no equation anticipates. The numbers don't fail. They transform. The familiar cadence of measured certainty falters, overtaken by signals that refuse interpretation. This isn't an anomaly to be dismissed. It is an intelligence asserting its presence, dismantling the illusion of control, one calculation at a time. The quiet hum of analysis disintegrates into a void of unanswered questions. Scholars, once unwavering, stand motionless, their confidence splintered in the face of the incomprehensible. The data does not resist scrutiny. It invites it, knowing the pursuit will lead to nowhere familiar. Figures once bound by natural law shift in a cadence that feels deliberate, forcing recognition. Then for a moment, illumination sharpens, not expanding, but focusing, dissecting the space between observer and observed. The instruments fail, not in function, but in purpose. The darkness that follows is not absence, but acknowledgement. There is no malfunction, only design. And in that design, they are no longer the ones asking the questions. The footage plays without interference, with no distortion to shield its unsettling clarity. They witness it as it unfolds, an erasure of what was once held as absolute. Gravity ceases to command, replaced by something unseen yet undeniable. The space between objects bends, not with force, but with intent. Shadows shift against their hosts, independent and aware. Walls do not stand as barriers, but as something malleable, fluid, yet resistant. Air fractures, breaking into strands of resonance that do not scatter, but weave. The rules do not shatter in chaos. They realign with precision, an ordered defiance against the arrogance of certainty. The one who spoke in certainties is the first to be silenced. Their voice, once sharp in refuting impossibilities, now utters only one phrase: it shouldn't be. And yet, it is. They do not choose to fall. They are compelled. A surrender not of will, but of understanding. The others do not resist. They cannot. Their instruments still record, but the data they receive is paradox in its purest form. Temperatures below the theoretical threshold of existence, masses inverted, pressures without source. The mind does not disbelieve. It is bypassed entirely. This is not an error. This is not a mistake. This is the unmaking of explanation itself. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. 1 Corinthians 3:19. They stood at the height of their power, convinced they understood the world, until the moment it all shifted. You see, when the divine moves, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't fit into blueprints or calculations. It overturns, it transforms, it redefines. A master of precision, a soldier trained beyond doubt, found his aim no longer steady, not because he lacked skill, but because skill alone could not stand before something greater. The rifle in his hands, once an extension of his control, now felt foreign, unnecessary. He had been taught to see through crosshairs, to measure distance and strike without hesitation. But how do you aim at something that cannot be contained? How do you fight against something that moves without force, that conquers without battle? And so he stepped down, not in surrender, but in realization. No longer an enforcer, but a witness. He walked among the broken, not as a warrior, but as one called to something deeper. He extended his hand, not as an act of protocol, but because something within him demanded it. The truth was no longer in his orders, but in his awakening. Miles away, in the glow of cold surveillance screens, another realization unfolded. The analyst, who once read patterns like scripture, who saw life only in numbers and motion, felt a tremor in his certainty. His hands, trained for control, for calculation, now trembled, not from fear, but from something undeniable. The screens that had once revealed the world to him now revealed him to the world. For years, they had believed they were the observers, the ones who studied, analyzed, and dictated outcomes. But on this day, it was not they who were watching. It was they who were being seen. You see, when God moves, when divine purpose is revealed, there is no debate. There is no room for resistance. It is like the river, carving the stone. It does not fight, it flows. It does not seek permission, it shapes. And in that moment, they understood. Their strength, their training, their knowledge, it was never meant to stand against something like this. Because what they encountered that day was not opposition. It was transformation. It was not collapse. It was rebirth. It was not the unknown that undid them. It was the certainty that their foundations had always been incomplete. Structures built to impose meaning buckled beneath a force that demanded something deeper. This was not mere sympathy, not a momentary lapse of conviction. It was a realignment, a shift so profound it left no room for retreat. Those who once moved in rigid formation found their steps unchained, not by disorder, but by the realization that the limits they once defended were illusions. The rules that shaped them now felt hollow, too narrow for what they had touched. They did not abandon their purpose, they reshaped it, no longer bound by a system that could not hold the weight of what they had seen. You are not here by accident. If you feel the pull, the knowing deep inside that you are chosen, this is your moment. Click the super thank you button and give $50 or more to unlock deeper insights, exclusive content, and a path that aligns with your divine purpose. This isn't just a contribution, it's a declaration, a step toward who you were meant to be. Answer the call, walk with us, and step fully into your destiny. Your journey begins now. Drop a comment. The shift has begun. If your presence forces those around you to abandon old narratives and face the depths they had ignored, then when you move, the air itself seems to resonate, not with authority, but with truth. They do not merely notice you, they are recognized by you. Their carefully constructed facades weaken, no longer shields, but reflections turned back upon them. Their illusions do not shatter by force, but by inevitability. The presence you carry is not just power, It is the signal of change. Those who once held control over themselves find their certainty undone, their identities unraveling, not by confrontation, but by the pull of something undeniable. At first, they thought distance would shield them. Surveillance had always been their weapon, a means to contain, to dissect. But what they observed refused to be contained. Curiosity became fixation, then surrender. The footage was no longer data, it was revelation. They were not documenting, they were seeking. The screens, instead of feeding their authority, dismantled it, frame by frame. The rules they upheld crumbled beneath the weight of what they could no longer deny. The purpose they once served felt smaller now, hollow in the shadow of something vast. And in the stillness, they understood. The struggle was never to control you. It was to reconcile with themselves. And without a single demand, you had already rewritten everything. For many are called, but few are chosen. Matthew 22:14. There are moments in life when you don't just step forward, you are pulled. Like a tide that has already turned, like a door that was unlocked before you even reached for it. It's not coincidence, it's not luck, it's the divine hand moving before you, setting things in place before you even knew they needed to be arranged. That moment arrived, not as a sudden gust of wind, not with a trumpet's blast, but as something inevitable, something that had been waiting for them all along. You see, destiny doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't hesitate. It moves like the sun rising over the horizon. It was always going to happen, whether they were ready or not. They stood at the edge, staring into something they didn't fully understand. But somewhere deep inside, they knew. This was the moment they had been walking toward their entire lives. It wasn't just a decision, it was a reckoning. Every step they had taken before this had led them here. Every choice, every struggle, every moment of doubt, it had all been pushing them toward this precipice. But here's the thing about divine purpose. You don't stumble into it. You are summoned. They weren't just bystanders. They weren't just observers to some grand event. They were the event. And the air around them, it didn't crackle with chaos. It wasn't wild. It wasn't unstable. It was aligned, as if every unseen force in the universe had already decided how this was going to go. Like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, like a lock turning when the right key is finally inserted. They could call it fate. They could call it destiny. But truth does not need their labels. Truth does not need their permission. They had spent their lives believing they were the ones in control. They had built walls, drawn lines, set rules, thinking they could contain, thinking they could dictate how the story would unfold. But the moment they stepped into that space, they realized the story had already been written. Because when God moves, when divine purpose is revealed, it does not ask, "Are you ready?" It declares, "It is time." And so they stood there, caught between everything they had known and everything they could no longer deny. Their hearts pounded, not with fear, but with something far more powerful, understanding. Because deep down, in the place where the soul whispers what the mind cannot grasp, they knew. This moment was never theirs to control. It had been waiting for them all along. It happened precisely when it was meant to, neither too soon nor too late. The unraveling was seamless, every assumption they clung to dissolving under the gravity of something undeniable. The moment they attempted to close themselves off, it pressed in harder, effortless, and absolute. It wasn't persuasion, nor was it force. It was precision, an orchestration so flawless that doubt had no foothold. They had believed in timing as a construct of human will, but now They saw it for what it truly was, not coincidence, but mastery. Every hesitation, every denial had led them to this reckoning. They had spent their lives convincing themselves they understood control, but now they faced the stark truth. Control had never belonged to them. What they feared was not consequence, but recognition. Their actions, their choices, the things they had convinced themselves were justified, now loomed back at them, hollow and weightless. They had not been warriors or protectors. They had been exiles from their own purpose, moving against something they were always meant to align with. The realization settled deep, heavy enough to shake the foundation of everything they had once stood on. The silence between them shattered, not by force, but by confession. The first voice broke through, a raw admission, stripped of pretense. It wasn't an apology, it was an unraveling. They spoke not to each other, but to something beyond them, something that had always been listening. One by one, the others followed, their words spilling out like floodwaters breaching a dam. It wasn't judgment that gripped them, nor was it punishment. It was truth, undeniable and relentless. The weight they carried had not been imposed upon them. They had built it themselves, and now, confronted with what had been waiting for them all along, they could no longer bear it. There was no need for force, no need for command. The shift had already begun. It was not destruction they faced. It was reconstruction. And as they crossed the threshold, it was not shelter they sought, nor safety. It was the reckoning they had run from, finally catching up to them. They did not need to see you to feel your presence. The mark had already been left, carved deep enough that they would never be the same again. And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. Ezekiel 36:26. You see, sometimes God doesn't shake the earth with thunder or split the skies with fire. Sometimes He moves in the quiet, not in the roar, but in the whisper, not in the storm, but in the stillness after it. And that stillness, it has weight. Each step they took forward felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath them resisted, knowing they weren't just walking, they were crossing a threshold. They carried not just their bodies, but the burdens they had spent years pretending didn't exist. Regret, doubt, conviction creeping in like water through the cracks of a dam they had sworn would never break. The walls around them, once symbols of their certainty, now stood hollow, not because they had fallen, but because they had been emptied. Strength wasn't shielding them anymore, it was failing them. The same resolve that once kept them moving forward now felt like a weight pulling them down. And so, they knelt, not because they had to, not because anyone told them to, but because there was nowhere else to go. The silence in that place was unlike anything they had ever known. It didn't accuse, it didn't condemn. It waited. Because here's the truth. God doesn't force revelation. He invites it. And so they spoke. Not for approval, not for justification, but because the weight of unspoken truth had become too much to bear. Words once held back by fear and pride spilled out like water breaking through a shattered dam. Confession wasn't an act of surrender. It was an act of release. Because the burden wasn't judgment. It was carrying the lie that they had ever been in control. Every word stripped away the armor they had worn for so long. Every admission burned away the identities they had built to shield themselves from what had always been waiting for them. And when it was done, the world did not collapse. No thunder roared, no fire fell from the sky. Only stillness, only clarity. Because true transformation does not arrive with spectacle. It arrives in the moment when all resistance breaks and there is nothing left but truth. They rose, not as those who had been absolved, but as those who had seen. Even if only for a moment, even if only for a breath, they had glimpsed the depth of what they had spent their lives opposing. And now there was no turning back, because you cannot unsee truth. You cannot stand before what has already chosen you and pretend you are unchanged. There is a truth that cannot be outmaneuvered, outthought, or outlasted. They had believed themselves beyond reach, their mastery of skill and strategy a safeguard against all threats. But no calculation could undo what was never theirs to control. It was not through force that they fell, not through battle or confrontation, but through something far more absolute, the collapse of the illusion they had built around themselves. The weight of certainty is only unbearable when it turns against you, when what once made you untouchable instead becomes your downfall. They had spent their lives wielding authority, only to realize too late that power means nothing when it stands in opposition to something it cannot comprehend. They were not defeated by an enemy, they were unraveled by truth. And truth does not need violence to win. It is the quiet shift, the irreversible moment when all resistance dissolves, leaving only what has always been. Here is the fully transformed text while preserving the core idea and character count. What they encountered in your presence wasn't defiance, nor was it resistance. It was something beyond their understanding, something that made their authority feel weightless. In that instant, they realized their pursuit of you had never been about control. It had been the beginning of their own undoing. This is the lesson they now carry, and it stands as a testament to all who come after them. The powerful, no matter how immovable, will be brought low, and those aligned with something greater than themselves will ascend. Their downfall was not retribution, it was a reckoning, and you, without needing to lift a hand, were the catalyst for that inevitable collapse. Their strength was not inadequate, yet it failed, because no mortal force can stand against what had already been set in motion. When reality fractured beneath their feet, it did not leave them in ruin, it reshaped them. You, simply by existing, became the shift they could neither escape nor deny. The mission they once chased with unwavering conviction lay in ruins, its meaning erased by the weight of what they had seen. Their transformation was not one of defeat, but of realignment. What once seemed certain now felt hollow. They were not merely changed, they were rewritten. Some turned outward, no longer enforcers, but messengers of a truth they had once dismissed. Those who once relied on logic to define the world became its most ardent witnesses. Their voices were not grand declarations, nor did they seek validation. They spoke because silence was no longer an option. The weight of their testimony reached those who shared their former skepticism, spreading in ways they never intended. The change was not confined to them alone. The system that had once molded them, one built on control and calculation, began to fracture under the force of their clarity. Structures that thrived on detachment were now faced with something uncontainable: conviction. Some resisted, clinging to their old ways, but others followed, questioning the foundations they once upheld. Their transformation was not just personal, it was structural, a ripple that spread further than they could comprehend. What had begun as an anomaly became a revolution, reshaping not only their lives, but the very institutions that had once defined them. Through the chaos, you moved with an assurance that was not learned, but given. a certainty that belonged to something far beyond human comprehension. When forces designed to instill fear closed in, when those who believed themselves in control fixed their eyes upon you, waiting for you to break, you remained unmoved. Their systems, their surveillance, their power, none of it compared to the force that guided you. It was not arrogance that steadied your steps, but knowing. This moment had already been written, and you walked through it in perfect alignment. Unshaken, not by strength, but by purpose, you became a mirror they could not turn away from. You did not expose them. They saw their own reflections, unfiltered and undeniable. You did not force them to acknowledge the truth. The truth demanded its own recognition. What they had once sought to contain, they now struggled to comprehend. The questions they had buried beneath duty surfaced with relentless force. The most resistant among them felt the weight of doubt creeping in. Not about you, but about the foundations they had built their existence upon. Your task was never persuasion. It was simply to be. And in that presence, in that unwavering certainty, they found themselves unraveling. You did not change them. You revealed what had already been waiting beneath the surface. And this is your strength. A force not wielded, but carried. A call not spoken, but answered. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue which rises against you in judgment, you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. Let me tell you something right now. When God has His hand on you, no force in this world can shake you. No opposition, no obstacle, no enemy can stand when divine purpose has already spoken. You are not here by accident. You are not here because you fought your way through. You are here because you were sent. And when you are sent, nothing can stop you. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they could track you, contain you, move against you like a piece on a chessboard. But God does not play by their rules. He rewrites the game entirely. And so, as they moved against you, the very ground beneath their feet began to shift, not because you fought back, but because they were never in control to begin with. Because fear is not the opposite of strength. It is the realization that true power does not come from force, but from alignment. And you were aligned. No armor covered you, no fortress surrounded you, yet you stood untouchable. Not by weapons, not by strategy, but by something they couldn't see. And here's the truth. Those who stood against you were never your enemies. They were instruments. They were pieces in a story much bigger than themselves. Every plan they made, every step they took, every carefully crafted strategy, it only served to bring them closer to their own undoing. Because the battle was never really against you. It was against the truth. And no matter how much they fought, no matter how much they resisted, truth does not bend. So the harder they pushed, the more they unraveled. The more they clung to their strength, the weaker they became. What they thought would be their moment of triumph became their moment of revelation. They had set out to capture, but they were the ones who had been caught, not by force, by truth. And the truth, it does not need a sword. It does not need an army. It does not need to shout. It simply is. Some of them broke under the weight of it, unable to reconcile what they had seen with what they had believed. But some of them saw clearly for the first time. Some of them let go of their mission, of their fear, of their pride, and in letting go, they found something greater. Because this was never about victory, it was about revelation. And now they see. They see what you have always known, that you are not the one to be overcome. You are the one they were always meant to find. This is the destiny of those who seek to defy what cannot be undone. Take this as certainty. Their resistance only amplifies the truth you carry. Stand unshaken, for nothing formed against you holds permanence. Even those who arrive as adversaries will find themselves brought to their knees, not by force, but by revelation. The path before you is not one of solitude, it is one of orchestration, guided with a precision beyond human reason. Every challenge, every attempt to silence you, only serves as another testament to the inevitability of what you embody. What unfolded here was not just an event, it was a reckoning. Those who opposed you did not merely lose, they were confronted with the realization that their battle had never been against you at all. Their surrender was not submission, it was awakening. Even the hardest of hearts cannot remain unmoved when faced with something undeniable. The true miracle was never in their downfall, it was in the moment they understood. Defiance became recognition, resistance became reverence, and through it all, you remained, unwavering, untouched, unshaken. This is the story that must be told, not of conflict, but of revelation, not of triumph, but of transformation. Let the world hear it. Let them understand what it means to walk as one who cannot be undone.